Well, thank you very much for inviting me to do this. It's certainly an honor, and I I so enjoyed my time at SFU, and owe so much to the economics faculty in particular. So it's really great to be able to come back and share a little bit of the story, and hopefully uh, you know pass on some learnings that I've had, and learn a little bit from everybody who's coming up through it now. Uh, the 2011, yeah, time has flown by. So
Crazy.
it's I'm sure things have changed a lot since then.
They have, and I'll get into detail after, but yeah, they have changed quite a bit.
So also just thanks everybody for coming in and joining. It's humbling to have everybody jump in and sort of spend some of their time listening to me for a little bit. So I'll try and keep it relatively brief and hopefully interesting. But yeah, looking forward to hearing from you as well in terms of questions and what we might be able to fill in. I'll go through a little bit of background and kind of touch on what I'm doing these days and try and get into some specifics on that. And we'll get into some of these later topics too if we can. Maybe just a bit on my story and how I kind of got to where I am. Yeah, this is great. I thought maybe an interesting framework for this would actually be, a common theme for me in my education and my work has always been data and data analysis. Hopefully that resonates with most of you studying economics, and that's kind of been the key stepping stone for me from job to job. And kind of an interesting thing around that is that process of, hey, there's always a data generation process. Then there's a cleaning element that you have to go through, then analysis, and ultimately getting to decisions. And a lot of the work that I've done kind of can be categorized in those different things, from an early job I had actually while I was at SFU, where I was doing a lot of data entry, literally reading through contracts and like entering them into a database. Then actually my first job after school was doing economic consulting, and that was a little bit of analysis, but in what it ended up being a lot of was really data cleaning. This was going through and just making sure, the ultimate thing for this job was making sure that everything was right and error free, and just really tying out disparate data sources and making sure it all came together, and a little bit of analysis at the end. And to where I am now in FP&A, where a lot of it is actually kind of tying back into more of the data generation process. There's still some analysis, but a lot of the work is actually in influencing decisions and behaviors that ultimately will create the next set of data. So it's interesting to kind of see it come full circle, but you're always doing a little bit of everything, but different phases of the job kind of go from, either you're helping to create the data, you're doing a little bit of analysis, you're helping to clean the data, doing a little bit of analysis, to ultimately helping back to being on the front end of the process with data creation. So I can give a little more detail on each of those jobs. Let's maybe start in chronological order with SFU. I studied economics at SFU, and originally I think I was had my sights set on the BBA program, but as I was taking more economics courses, I found myself just falling more and more in love with that, and that's what was really kind of driving my passion. And that pulled me to really stay with economics and keep picking off a few interesting business courses here and there. I'm really happy I did that. I think I kind of entered SFU as a pretty average student, and the more I went deep on economics, the stronger my grades got, the stronger my sort of passion was for it, and that came through in performance. I did actually follow that up by doing a year at Queen's in the master's program there. I think I still probably owe them a paper, but I did all the classwork there. But that led me to this job in economic consulting with a company called Analyst Group. That's where I was saying this ended up being a lot of data cleaning. I'm not sure how familiar people are with economic consulting, but it was kind of a new field for me. But the pitch was that this was going to be kind of a blend between a rigorous academic approach tied to real world business problems. And so the classic bread and butter for this industry, and what I ended up doing a lot of work on, was helping with damages and expert testimony for lawsuits. So one party would be suing another, maybe a patent infringement or something like that, and you'd work with an expert to kind of do an assessment of what the valuation of that patent portfolio would be, or what damages would be, something like that. So it was really interesting. A lot of the good things along with that is you get exposure to a ton of different industries, a ton of different businesses, and you get to work with really some of the top minds. Most of the people at the firm had a PhD in economics from Stanford, or a PhD in economics from Harvard, University of Chicago, like really premium names, or like MBAs from this school and that school. So it was really cool, really like high caliber people to work with. I should also say, lots of people from non-super premium schools that were equally brilliant, and definitely a good Canadian contingent there as well. So it's certainly not a prerequisite, but it did definitely create this environment where you just got to work with some really brilliant people. Yeah, I would say that there was a reality of the job was being the low man on the totem pole. A lot of the work was around, like I was saying, more data cleaning. So you'd come up with a model, and it had to be relatively simple, especially in the frame of litigation, because you needed to be able to explain it to either a jury or a court. So you couldn't come up with the most complex, cutting edge, kind of, really hairy economic model. It needed to be something that could be communicated clearly and effectively to a group of non-experts. And the data cleaning became so important because it's also kind of adversarial. You'd be writing a report, and there would be a team on another side of a lawsuit writing an opposing report. And you then kind of get a chance to take a look at each other's, and you try and tear it apart. So you needed, sort of zero error rates. So a lot of the work, a lot of time was just going through and cleaning and making sure that everything tied in perfectly. So really high attention to detail.
So Rob, I was gonna stop you right there for a second. So you've given us a lot of information. So I'm going to give you the background of all our students, and then I'll ask you a specific question. So many of our students are graduating probably this semester. There's some alumni in the crowd. There's also some high school students who are just coming into SFU, and we have our first and second year students. We have majors, minors, honor students. We have some master's students in the audience as well. So for everyone's sake, let's go right to the beginning of SFU, right? And when you entered entered SFU. We know you took your first year general courses, which would be Econ 103, 105. You did your calc. The first question really is, what turned you on to economics, and why did you see the relevance in it?
Oh yeah, great question. I think well, the first part, what turned me onto it was I think it was some mandatory prereqs. You
For sure.
had to do some micro and macro and all of that kind of thing. And I think the thing that always really appealed to me of it was kind of the fundamental problem around trying to optimize within a constrained resource environment. And that was always an appealing problem to me. And then there were a few early electives that I remember at SFU, like there was a money and banking course that just were insightful in ways of things that I hadn't really thought about, but as soon as they started explaining it, I kind of pulled back the curtains and became, a few non-obvious things kind of coming out and all of a sudden starting to make sense. And that really appealed to me and spurred me to want to do more of it.
Perfect. So you're in the middle of your degree. So I would say second year, right? And you're saying, okay, because to let everyone know, in 2011, the program looked much different. Econ 201 was actually Econ 301 at that point. And his statistics class, Robb's statistics class, I don't know if you were introduced to R then, but maybe just the beginning of R, because it's much more in depth now. So where did this idea of data analysis come in? Because you said you did some data work after school or while you were in school. What did that mean? What did that look like?
Yeah, it was. It's interesting to hear that some of that is being pushed forward in the degree, which is probably good. But the first time I really got into some data analysis was probably in the third year course. I think there was more of a theoretical econometrics class that we did first, that I had to reread this for, and there was a little bit of hands-on stuff with that, and then there was a follow-up course that was much more hands-on that I think Brian Kraut was teaching.
Yeah, so that was industrial economics, 325, I believe. No?
No, I'm thinking of it was still econometrics.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and we were using R, and you actually got kind of hands-on with it and got to try and put together a bit of an analysis and a study, and that was really really interesting. But yeah, we really didn't touch a statistical package until pretty late in the degree, and it was kind of getting thrown in. To me, it felt like thrown in at the deep end, not having had a lot of exposure to it. But it was immediately like, okay, the point of this is to be able to run these regressions, and we've gone through all the theory and the math behind it. So now here's quickly how to kind of code it up, which was great, but and very much kind of maps to the real world where you need to figure out a lot of this stuff on your own as well. But moving that forward in the process, I think would have been really helpful.
Perfect. So you're in your second, third year. You're doing a little bit of work. You said afterwards, just being basically just data entry, right? So you're in your third year. So a lot of these students are in their third and fourth year, and they're saying, okay, look, I'm really into data. We'll ask about advice and what they should do now as opposed to what you did. Was there anything you were doing specifically back then that really helped you out outside of school?
I was always working while I was in school, and one of the jobs I managed to get was working on sort of a research team actually for the Health Employers Association of BC. And that was part of what I was referencing to with data entry, was helping to populate some databases there. So it wasn't a lot of hard skills that were helpful, but it was an opportunity to just kind of be up close with a team they were hiring economists, and they were, putting a lot of what we were learning into practice. And so just having exposure to a team that was doing that, I think was really helpful and kind of showed some of the path of how what I was studying, in school actually translated into at least one real world environment.
Perfect. And so, so now you're in your third and fourth year. You're in your fourth year. You're probably taking. I know you're taking econometrics. I know you're taking. Advanced micro, macro. But now you're deciding what you're going to do in terms of next steps. So this is pretty important for a lot of students here. So some are already advanced, and other students are like, okay, what can I do for my next steps here? You chose to go and do your master's, but what led you to that decision to do your master's?
Yeah, I'm trying to think back on that. I think part of it was probably honestly just putting off the daunting task of having to get a job after school.
Completely legitimate.
Yes. Yeah. No, it's I think I was both looking for jobs and evaluating whether to keep going in school. I felt like continuing and doing a master's degree would probably bolster my chances for certain jobs, and make me a little more marketable, at least within Canada, which I think is true within Canada. One thing that's been interesting for me is I wasn't at the time really eyeing up coming to the US to work, but having come down here, master's programs in economics are not very common and not really set up the way that they are in Canada. It's usually something that's only done within the context of the PhD program. So a lot of my colleagues at Analysis Group were coming straight out of undergrad. So that was something where my sort of calculus on, oh, hey, a master's degree will kind of might be necessary or might set me apart, here is actually a little more of a confusing signal. It differentiates in some ways, but a lot of people actually just kind of see it as like you like dropped out of a PhD program rather than like you added this thing. So that was just kind of an interesting learning that I wasn't really anticipating.
So let's do some fast forwarding here because people really want to get to Google. I sense it. So sure. You finish your undergrad, and we'll talk about things that people can do while they're still in university. Obviously, I want to emphasize, getting involved and all that stuff. We'll talk about all that stuff later and talking to people. So you're at Queen's. You've started your master's program. I know when I sat and chatted with you, Rob, I was under the impression that you had a wide array of master's programs to choose from. But just to let everyone know, and I'll let them know, Rob actually only had one offer, and that was from Queen's. Okay, so we're not going to get into GPA right here. We're not going to get into anything like that right here. But one program offered you a chance, and you got in, and you took it. So meaning there's a lot of people that maybe said, maybe it's not for you right now. So anyway, so you got into the master's program, finished it over at Queen's. It was a one-year program, Rob?
Yeah.
So what brought you from there to San Francisco?
Yeah. So I realized pretty quickly in the master's program that a PhD was not a good path for me. So started looking pretty quickly for work options coming out of that program. And did the sort of what was typical, what I was seeing a lot of my classmates at the time looking at, Bank of Canada, I was always interested in finance. So, applied to some investment banking programs, a bunch of stuff like that. But there was this one opportunity that was kind of sticking out in the back of my mind, which was this economic consulting. And I had actually learned about it kind of from an offhand comment of somebody that I met through the finance club at SFU. So while I was studying at SFU, I was always interested in finance and pursuing that, more out of investment banking, but just generally as like an industry. And so I got involved with the finance club and started participating in some of the kind of extracurriculars around the business faculty. And that led to me doing a case competition, and one of the mentors from outside of SFU who got involved with the case competition had actually worked for this company analysis group down in the Bay Area and had subsequently moved to Vancouver. And while he was sharing some of his story with a group of us at lunch one day, he mentioned that his first job out of undergrad was not in finance, but in economic consulting. And I'd never heard of it. And I was the only person sitting at the table who was majoring in economics, not finance or accounting. But wait, go back, what was that? And he told me a little bit about it. And I said, that actually sounds really interesting. And so I tucked that away. And, about a year later, as I was coming through the master's program, I got back in touch with him. And he was generous enough to connect me with the company, and one thing led to another, and ended up getting a job offer. At the time it was like the middle of February, and I was sitting in Kingston, Ontario, so it was about 3 feet of snow at the window, and they offered me a job in their Menlo Park office, which is just outside of San Francisco here. So that seemed like a really good option in the middle of winter in Ontario. So it was never a plan to come down to San Francisco, but was happy to jump on that when I saw it.
Was that Google, or was that another organization first?
That was this consulting company, analysis group.
Oh, analysis group. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to summarize here quickly before you get into the Google. Just to let everyone know, and we'll get into this again, Rob is missing some pieces here. One is he was quite involved in different aspects of SFU life. One thing that was huge was he was part of the SFU Finance Club, or the Business Finance Club, which means a lot of you are under the impression that a lot of these clubs that are headed by different departments in the university are exclusively for those students. That is not the case. We have many students in our the Economic Student Society who are not who are doing minors in econ, who are actually majors in other programs, engineering to business, to sociology, believe it or not. So Rob got involved with the finance club because he was interested in finance, like many people are, and he was very active. Rob also went to every single one of these workshops that we're doing right now. He went to the career workshop. He went to everything, and so he was very involved with what was happening at SFU, economics as well. So just a little point of advice: he always kept his ears open and connected with people, in a very sort of friendly way, which led him to Queens. And then from Queens, it was just this person he happened to be in touch with through the SFU Finance Club, which got him this job. So that leads us to San Francisco. You're working as an economic consultant. Just a quick question. When you mentioned data cleaning, right? And you're doing some data cleaning even as a kind of undergrad. What does data cleaning mean? And then you can go on to Google from there.
Yeah, it can take a lot of forms, but what this looked like for me was we would often be looking at sort of contained data sets, but trying to map them together and create master data sets. And so you'd just be looking at, hey, does that pull together in the same way? Are there duplicate entries? Where are there errors because maybe pulled something in from a PDF and, a 1 has been replaced with an L. All these things that you can kind of throw off your analysis. So a lot of it just sort of grunt work and making sure, these are all things that software is starting to get better about taking care of for us. Right. But certainly at that time, and when you have sort of really low tolerance for errors, they were throwing people at it, and I was the people.
Perfect. That's a great general definition. All right, so you're in economic consulting in San Francisco, and Google called, or you made that connection. How did that happen?
Yeah, it's once you're in the Bay Area, it's hard not to get sort of sucked into the vortex of Google and Facebook and whatnot. They're really huge companies, and they're growing at just impressive rates. So they're kind of sucking up talent wherever they can get it. And so I had some friends and colleagues, over the years, move over there, and once they get there, it's hard not to hear about how good life is and the interesting stuff that they're working on. And so when I was feeling like it was time for a change from consulting, I started applying to a bunch of startups, but also Google and Facebook and whatnot, and was lucky enough to get an opportunity to join Google after a lot of interviews, a lot of rejections, but was really happy. I got an offer to actually join their HR team in a data analytics kind of role. So yeah, that was a lot of fun.
So sorry, what was the job, Rob?
Yeah, it was working on the HR team at Google, or they call it people operations, and it was essentially doing program management around some of the cyclical HR programs, like performance management and compensation planning. And I had no background in HR. I didn't have a particularly strong interest in HR leading up to that, but through talking to them, Google takes a very data-driven approach to HR. And so the way that they did it and the way that they thought about it was just fascinating. And this team in particular was looking to bolster some of their kind of traditional programming. It was somebody with a good data analytics skill set. And brought me in to kind of help with that.
Perfect. So at that point, Rob, what set of skills did you have, if you could quantify that?
Yeah.
I'm sure people will take note here.
So that's a good question. As you mentioned earlier, I've done a lot of econometric and statistical work in R and Stata in school. I did a bit more of that while I was in analysis group, but much more heavily got into Excel when I was in consulting. I kind of laugh because I think I always put that I was good with Excel on my resume for like years and years, and I honestly had no idea what that even really meant until I got into that job. And a lot of the work was done in spreadsheets. And to be honest, that's still the predominant way that we're doing any data analysis today. I'm unfortunately not doing a lot of regression analysis or statistical stuff. Most of it's fairly simple stuff, but it's pretty much all happening in spreadsheets. So
I'm going to ask you.
Skill add, yeah.
Okay, so that's a skill. I'm going to stop right there for a second. Can you dig into Excel just a little bit? So let's talk about the basic. Are you going into macros, pivot tables? Are you doing any programming within Excel? if you could quickly
Yeah,
touch.
well, and I got to plug now. Now let's transition to Google Sheets. Google Sheets is
Okay.
great. And stop using Excel. But no, the interoperability between the two is pretty strong now. But you know, it's just getting into some really basic formulas in terms of being able to sort of map data together, like VLOOKUPs and index, like, you know, all these sort of formulas for really just combining data and being able to look up the right thing. And then a lot of the analysis, yeah, it can be as simple as pivot tables, or, you know, something where you're getting a little more complicated and you're kind of building out your own model, from, you know, this is getting into more like financial stuff, where if you're in finance, you know, spreadsheets are the real bread and butter, and you're building the model yourself, you're designing the model, and you're just kind of using formulas to be able to kind of look at the right stuff. So the formulas themselves aren't super complicated. It's more the model being built.
Perfect. And so we'll stop at Excel. Any other skills? So you've mentioned Stata that you had before already. R, Excel, which would you say you're an expert?
It probably was coming out of the consulting company, and I think my skills have dropped off a little bit from there.
Right.
You know, I'm less sort of heavy in the data analysis on a day-to-day basis now, and spend a little bit more of my time just kind of influencing and driving processes and decisions, and supplementing that with some analysis. But the one skill that I think was missing that I had to I had to do some extra work to kind of pick up to make the jump from consulting into Google, and I think is true of a lot of jobs now, is SQL. And so the difference there was in school and in consulting, we were always kind of handed a data set, and it was a self-contained data set. And once you get into operating within a company, usually that data all lives in a database. And a fundamental skill, I still see this in you know, all the job postings we're writing, and anytime I'm ever kind of considering another job, usually SQL is still one of the fundamental skills that's required. So they want you to have the ability to go in and query data out of the database yourself, and not have to rely on another team to do that. And that was something that I hadn't gotten any exposure to, and I really had to add that for myself.
That's really good to know. Anything else, Rob? So I'm talking about your skill set before you entered that job at Google, and then we'll talk about the interview process quickly. Anything else you want to add in terms of that skill set? Besides, we could talk about communication skills, maybe some writing skills.
I think, yeah, I think, you know, sort of combining those, that would be the other big thing, is communication skills. I touched on this a little bit when I was talking about, you know, analysis group, but you know, there's so much around. We focus so much on the technical skills and sort of the theoretical skills around modeling and quantitative stuff, and it's really challenging to make that useful unless you can really master communication. And so much of that is usually how do you communicate that to a non-expert audience. You know, you're really supposed to be bringing that skill set and that expertise and deriving insights from your analysis, and then communicating that to a group of people and an audience that more often than not do not have that skill set. So you need to be able to communicate it in a way that'll sort of be received well. And then as you get into more of a corporate setting, and this comes through in consulting all the time, is, you know, what's important to your audience, and really distilling it down to you know, what's going to resonate with them and what are the key takeaways. And so the theme there is usually just short, to the point where you're really just writing like 2 or 3 bullet points, and then backing it up with all the detail that went into it.
So, so we could talk about your first job and what you did, but just generally in any job that you're doing at Google, I mean, there's so many millions of jobs at Google, but how much of it is actually sitting in front of a computer and just, you know, maybe coding or you know, development, and how much of that job is actually communicating and talking to other people, maybe even clients? What would you say generally is the breakdown? I know it's hard
I
to
would say,
pinpoint.
yeah, in the jobs that I've had, it's probably been about 50-50. And then as you sort of move up and get more senior, it tends to skew away from sitting in front of the computer and more into just communication.
Perfect. So let's talk about your job, Rob. But just quickly go over. Thanks for that, Carmen. Quickly talk about the interview process and how long it took to get into Google. And is it the question that everyone asks is it an impenetrable wall? Because for us, from our, you know, you work there, and people just want to know how they could possibly, you know, go that direction. And then we'll talk about this slide.
Yeah, it's certainly not an impenetrable wall. You know, there's a lot of Canadians working at Google. We've got a Canadians at Google group. So but it's kind of tough to get into. You know, we get a lot of applicants, and the best thing that you can do is usually have a referral in from a current employee, and you know, that can be tough when you kind of don't have the network there, which is why I was saying, you know, that was a big part of it for me, was being in the area where there's a lot of people who work at the company. You kind of end up building that up naturally. But we can talk a little bit, you know, about how people can approach that, kind of coming out of undergrad. But yeah, the interview process is a little daunting, not in the sense that it's terribly hard or a lot harder interviews than any other company. It is long, they're pretty thorough. You do a lot of interviews, and you know, I think it probably took about 3 months altogether, from the start of really having the conversations to panel interviews and coming in for on-sites, and then that has to get kicked to a hiring committee. So yeah, it's a pretty long process. I know there's books about it and whatnot. I think most of them are pretty actually geared towards the software engineering interviews. So you know, if you're coming in from an economics background or looking at something like data science or finance or something like that, it's a little different, and probably not as tough. But I'd say like a common theme is, you know, you're often asked or given an assignment ahead of time, to demonstrate some of your quantitative skills. And so that's something that most people should expect. It's kind of a nice way to do it, where you're not necessarily being put on the spot and doing a whiteboarding exercise, because you know, not everybody reacts well to that, and that's not necessarily a good show of your potential. Some people crush it, and other people kind of freeze up, and those people could be equally good at doing their job. So they try and stay away from that a little bit, and more so let you do an exercise on your own time and kind of come back and submit it, you know, a day or two later.
Do you generally remember what that exercise was, that quantitative exercise?
Yeah, it really sort of differs on the job, but it'll usually be like, hey, here's a data set, and you know, here's a targeted set of insights that we're looking for out of this data set. And they just want to see you actually get hands-on, and then also how you know, there'll be some data cleaning element to it usually. Can you spot some errors and sort of get rid of them, control for that? Can you do some quantitative analysis with it? And then what insights do you actually pull, and how well do you communicate that. So, we'll usually ask you to put that into a mini deck or a set of slides.
And what skills do you think you applied to that in terms of quantitative skills?
Yeah, so that'll be pretty much all of them. It's usually, in my experience, that's been a spreadsheet exercise. But you usually have sort of your choice of tools, and it'll be pretty job specific. So you should have a good sense of like what are the skills that the job is looking for. Is it financial modeling? Is it statistical analysis? And they'll usually be testing that.
Did you have to be familiar with the Google tools in order to get through this interview process?
Probably no. No more than say using like Google Sheets. But if you wanted to, you could probably do that in Excel. I would definitely encourage you to, if you're ever facing that situation where you've got sort of a job interview assignment, use a tool that you're very comfortable with and familiar with. You don't want that to be the stressor.
Perfect. Okay, so you've gone through this interview process. One last question about the interview process and specifics. Did they ask you to quantify or write anything or communicate anything? So whether it's a report writing, whether it's a précis, a summary, anything like that?
Maybe just some slides.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, so you've been working for Google for how long now?
About 5 years.
And you are currently a financial analyst, but as you said, you sort of gave yourself that job title when we were doing a prep for this interview. So let's get into financial analysis a little bit, and I'm going to backtrack a little bit, and then we're going to get into some questions because I know people have tons of it. I don't want to get into specifics in terms of exactly what your detailed job is, but maybe some generalities following this slide in terms of your job, the difference between what you're doing in sort of corporate finance and banking, and then some primary responsibilities. And I think people are just looking for, really, they're looking for some key notes in terms of what they've taken in finance. And I know this is a lot to ask, but if you can sort of speak to some of the econ background that you have and how it applied to some of this work. And maybe not specifically the master's program, maybe the undergrad. Was that a lot to take in? Okay, perfect.
Remind me if I get off track.
Okay.
Let me set this up a little bit too. Is as I mentioned, I always kind of was interested in finance as a potential field and career, and so, but I admittedly, ended up repeatedly realizing that I didn't know nearly as much as I thought I knew. And one of those areas that was like, I really didn't understand the landscape of what jobs were in the finance industry. I'd kind of learned about one or two, and then I'd be speaking about others that, I was, one that sticks out for me was at some point I was telling people that I wanted to go into private equity after university, and I was thinking it was something totally different than what it was. And there were some nice folks who graciously didn't kind of laugh at me as I was talking to them about it. I think maybe helpful to just lay it out as sort of plainly as possible. My current job is an FP&A analyst, which is financial planning and analysis. And helpful to say that that's a job within corporate finance, which kind of differs significantly from a lot of what I was thinking of as finance, which is more so on the banking and investing side. So corporate finance, I'm sure a lot of you will know this, but this is where you're really operating within a company. And that's like somebody, usually the organization that reports to the CFO of a company. And that's where you've got your controllership group, which is usually mostly accounting, FP&A, who does a lot of they sort of own the P&L and the forecast, and try and help with resource allocation. And then there's a treasury group, and sometimes there's more like specialty teams, but that's kind of the big breakdown of corporate finance. So we're not doing any investing. We're helping to actually kind of run the business. So within that, like I was saying, the sort of primary responsibilities for FP&A are to help the business with resource allocation. And so what that looks like for me is I'm essentially the sort of finance point person to work with a functional leader of a different part of the business. So right now I'm working with a VP of engineering to help run his organization and make sure that we understand how they're using their resources and how that ties into the bigger sort of picture for the company. What they're working on, what they're helping with, and what sort of financial impact that's going to have. So there's regular routine things that we do, like a monthly forecast and close process. I won't get too much into that. There's more of an annual and quarterly sort of budget planning process that we're responsible for running, which is what ties together a lot of this stuff. And within that, what you're helping to do is kind of figure out return on investment for different opportunities that they have in front of them. This ties back into the economics problem that we were talking about earlier, which is you've got a constrained set of resources, meaning money and people, and you've got this sort of multivariate optimization problem. How do we get the most out of these resources? What are our priorities? What do we want to get done? And what's the best way to go about sort of what we've got to be able to do those in the next quarter or the next year or the next 5 years? And so helping to sort of evaluate the different options that they have. Hey, if we put a team of 10 people on this, then what will we get out of it, 6 months later? That kind of thing. And then just prioritize those things using ROIs as one of the sort of methods to help assess that. I think the last thing I mentioned here was the spend management process, which is something that I've started to realize the sort of importance of a little more lately, which is, again, that kind of influencing behaviors much more than any sort of analysis or anything. This is, hey, how do we make sure that people are just kind of doing the right things so that we have clean inputs and clean data for us to work with? And so that's, how do people buy things? How do we keep track of whether that gets recognized, and how do we know what's coming up in the future?
Can you give us a typical example of, say, something in the spend management process that would sort of highlight that, like something simple, a simple example?
Yeah. So a lot of this is like, let's avoid bad behavior. So we want to make sure that people are like actually have a contract and a purchase order sort of in place and signed off and approved before they get a new vendor in and working on something. So this is real table stakes, but it's just kind of making sure some of the risk mitigation stuff is happening like that. So believe it or not, you might actually see like somebody hiring a team of external sort of engineers to help build something, but they haven't gone through our sort of official procurement process. And so all of a sudden you just kind of learn about this team that's doing something, and then you get an email saying, hey, I owe this team, like a couple $100,000 for the work that they've done over the last few months. How do I get this done?
Wow.
There's a whole process here that you were supposed to go through to make sure that we vet them and the contract makes sense, and that, all that kind of stuff. So it's making sure that everybody knows about those things, and everything's kind of flowing through the right processes.
In terms of your modeling, your finance background, did you do any finance in your undergrad? And what type of modeling are you using?
Yeah, so a lot of the modeling is uh, pretty basic stuff, to be perfectly honest. You're kind of doing like present value calculations, just kind of pulling forward. Hey, if we get this in the future, then what's that going to be worth today? How do we think about that? Let's do a bit of sensitivity analysis around it. Maybe some more interesting stuff that was new to me that I've picked up is a lot of stuff around at more of a unit metrics level for a business. And so how we're thinking about that is at more of a customer level. So a big one for us is lifetime value of customers.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And yeah, so there's it's the math on it is actually pretty simple. Conceptually, it's not overly complicated. And it pulls together a lot of those concepts. But these are pretty interesting ways to get in and analyze business, especially as you start to segment them out and understand your customer base a little bit differently.
I guess the point I'm trying to make as well, Rob, is the level of knowledge needed or modeling. Some people think, oh my God, I have to learn all these, I have to be able to walk in and start, looking at data and start modeling it. And, everything is at a very, very high advanced level. But in reality, what I'm hearing is a lot of the foundational skills in Excel and in SQL and your basic modeling is just used and then refined through texture and time and repetition, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say directionally, even in certainly in a master's program, but even in what we were doing in undergrad, like conceptually, the things that you're doing at the end of your university degree are much more complex than what you're actually going to do in industry. And so that's also maybe a heads up as like that can be experienced as a bit of a letdown, right? You'll kind of feel like you're doing a step down. You're kind of at the peak of really looking at some pretty interesting, pretty complex, pretty nuanced things in the SFU honors program, and the stuff that you end up doing on a day-to-day basis in industry is a lot more simple. But the trade-off there is now you're kind of playing with live ammunition, right? And so it's real dollars, and it's important to get it pretty right or to be pretty quick. That's an interesting trade-off that I've come to understand is really valuable as well. But yeah, the level of rigor and the complexity of the models tends to actually be a step down from what you're probably doing these days in school.
I'm going to ask for your typical day, and because I'm aware of the time. I know that we've told everyone it's from 11. I kind of said 11:30 to 12:30. I knew it would go longer. We have you till 1 o'clock, so I really want to leave a lot of time for questions. Carmen, perhaps you can go to the next slide, but if you can just tell us about your typical day, that would be great, and then we can start asking questions. We'll open up to questions, and then we'll also answer the economics question as well. I think yeah.
Okay, we'll do a real quick version of typical day, and forgive me because I'll do typical day from like a few months ago. Typical day now is
it's different.
Probably the same as all of you. Stay in my house. But it would be so I get up pretty early and to try and beat traffic. One thing is I live in San Francisco, and my office is about like 40 kilometers away. So I do a bit of a commute, and Google is kind enough to provide shuttle buses for us to commute on. So I head out at about 6:30 and catch a bus, and get to the office about an hour and a half later, straight into the cafe to grab some breakfast and coffee, which is awesome. I'm so grateful for not having to make my own breakfast in the mornings, because I can kind of just get up and leave.
This is all free,
then,
obviously.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. All included. And then kind of get to work. I'd say, as we were touching on earlier, a typical workday is probably about anywhere between 3, 5 to like 7 meetings during the day, doing a lot of email in between, and then usually about an hour or two in various blocks of time of more like quiet work at the computer. I'll try and block out more time later in the day for some actual analysis. But it's a lot of meetings and emails. So like we're saying, communication is really a big part of it. I try and be pretty diligent about making sure I get a good 15, 20 minutes for lunch in the middle of the day. And then, but it's a lot of walking around and moving back and forth between meetings, and just kind of being on the go most of the day. Then usually quit about 6 o'clock, try and do a quick workout, grab some dinner at the cafe, and then get on a shuttle bus at about 7:30 and head back home. I should say that's sort of a willingly long day where I'm trying to avoid the traffic. Is part of what I'm optimizing for. So it's not necessarily that it's supposed to be like a super grueling long day where they just work you to death. It's actually a pretty good work-life balance and culture around that. So I kind of work in some stuff that I want to do and catch earlier and later buses just to minimize the commute.
Thanks, Rob. So we can move on to the next slide, but we can also open it up to questions. What that next slide is, we have a chat here as well. So if people want to ask questions, but is there any questions so far? I mean, can we open that up? If you have a question, just put in the chat. Okay, so while you were doing that, just this slide, Rob, in terms of how econ helps specifically, maybe you've touched on a lot of this, but if you just want to do it quick.
Yeah, so I think, as we've touched on, right, definitely at a base level, your pitch can be quantitative and analytical skills. They're in high demand, and you can take that in a lot of different directions. But economics is a really sort of in-demand major for a lot of finance jobs. If you want to do something a little more advanced, then getting into data science, things like that. As we've touched on it, I think that maybe hopefully the programs have changed a little bit to keep up with what that looks like. It sounds like there's a kind of a data analytics program that you guys are also doing, which sounds super exciting.
Yeah, so for high school students and going to first, maybe second year, perhaps third year, there's a social data analytics program that's just been put on the books. It's going to start this September. So for those who are interested, so you'll be hearing more about that as we move forward. But that's just coming up.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. I think of some more general things is that mindset, right, of optimization under resource constraints and uncertainty is also the thing, right? Like industry and business is changing so much. It's how do you think about the future and how do you make trade-offs? And I think that even if you don't end up doing something directly tied into economics as a job, you spend so much time kind of thinking in this mindset and solving problems this way, and you're just getting repetitions of sort of quantifying problems, and then trying to come out with what you think is going to be an optimal solution is a really helpful thing that I feel like I tap into regularly. And then the last thing, and there's others, obviously, but I think the last thing I'll mention here is the systems thinking. This is a common thing that you'll hear people, especially in tech, talking about, is they want systems thinkers. And at least one way of thinking about that, if you're more on the business side of things rather than like an engineering side of things, which that can also apply to. But you know, it's especially as you get into a leadership position within a business, can you kind of formulate the model of the business in your head, and then start to identify the levers. And this is, for me, I really tie back to a lot of our econometrics work, where you can literally see the linear regression equation and how the different variables interact, and you know what the coefficients are and that kind of thing. Right? Not to keep going on it too much, but like, you know, that's roughly, it's like, can you build the equation of the business in your head and figure out, okay, if we increase this, then what happens? You know, how much does revenue go up?
Right.
Do our margins get better or worse? Will that cause us to have to increase or decrease something else? You know, what are the trade-offs kind of between the things? And so that's where I think a lot of our background in economics can help give us a head start on being able to do that.
I've got a question here for you, Rob, that we'll insert here about technical skill development. Would you list SQL on your resume if you've only taken SQL courses online, since it's not that common to have SQL taught or used in most classes, unlike Excel? What do you think of that? That's a good question.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's something that I see explicitly asked for in job descriptions as like a required or nice to have skill. And so I think it's always helpful to write your resume, you know, pretty specifically to the job posting that you're applying for. So if you've got it, then put it on there. I think I hear you saying, hey, I may not have, you know, like I haven't been working in SQL, you know, day in, day out for a year or so. So just be, you know, kind of transparent about that, but it shows a willingness to learn and that you're taking some initiative around it.
Any other questions that I see? I've got some general questions for you, Rob. Did your jobs or any of your jobs that you've had thus far, and including Google, did they ask for your transcript?
No, I don't think so. Yeah, no, I don't believe so.
Rob, in terms of your undergraduate degree, some advice right now on what other things that they can do while they're doing their undergraduate degree. I know go to these things is definitely a big part of it, but I mean, what else?
Yeah, I think as you were pointing out earlier, I shared a story of like one guy that I had met through one sort of extracurricular thing that I'd been doing that ended up leading to this job, but or the Java analysis group, which sort of led to the job at Google. But I did a whole bunch of stuff, and I went to a lot of these career chats and whatnot. And you just never know which is really going to stick or land. So the more that you can kind of put yourself out there and just get exposure to different experiences and things and people, you know, the more that those you never really know which one is going to lead to kind of the right opportunity for you. So yeah, I would say just try and be super active in the community, say yes to a lot of stuff. You're so sort of early in your path that it's really hard to know what is going to be the right thing to pursue.
I think that's a common theme with all our speakers, and every single speaker I've had, which is get involved. You don't know if you look at things as always beneficial, even if they're of no use to you. They're always a benefit, because at the very least you'll figure out what you don't like, and it's really important. I have another question here, Rob, from Angela. If you can recall, which of the undergraduate courses that you took at SFU were the most beneficial and helped you the most with your career in economics?
Cool. Interesting. Hard to say from like a kind of technical perspective, but so I would say it was the ones that had me kept me the most interested and the most engaged, and really wanted me, or had me wanting to spend more time sort of pursuing it. I mentioned this a little bit earlier. Like, I very transparently, like, I was a very average student coming into SFU, and my GPA kind of went up as I got through it, and the more I went deeper into economics, the stronger my grades got. So all those courses that kind of spurred me to be more genuinely interested in it, I think really helped propel me further. And so early versions of that were sort of like an introductory econometrics course, industrial organization. I thought was super interesting. That was I think a 3-year course.
They're 325. Yeah, I'm just mentioning what the numbers are.
Yeah, and then I also did a bunch of kind of like summer seminar courses, mostly because I was like trying to catch up and go through it a little faster. But a lot of those were just fascinating, and it showed me these sort of different applications for economic thinking. So some that come to mind, one on the finance side was like a financial modeling and time series course that Ramo was teaching. And then one was a law and economics course that was really, really fascinating and pretty eye-opening. And then something I've really kind of carried through as an interest is behavioral economics. And I was I think that was a summer course as well that Jasmina was teaching. So a lot of those sort of like extra seminar courses I found just really fascinating, and that helped me keep me more motivated for a lot of the core ones, which I think were also interesting, but maybe a little drier. You could start to see some of the other applications of the theory that you were learning.
So just to put some context there, so 483 is the computational economics class, and I'm trying to think of the others, but they are offered in the fall. Just continue to look. We have another question here. If you were into BBA, why didn't you do a joint major? Good question.
Yeah. I think I probably didn't have the GPA to get into a BBA major when I first transferred to SFU. I transferred from like Langara. So I came in sort of partway through the degree. I don't think I had the GPA to get into the BBA program right away. And then later when I did, I think I was, it was becoming clear that I wanted to at least have the grad school door open to me, and that doing the honors program was the way to do that. And at least at the time, that the honors program required you to do a lot more economics credits and upper division economics credits. So you really kind of had to concentrate, which is why I ended up taking a lot of these seminar courses and whatnot, which I think were really interesting. But I felt like there was a bit of a trade-off there, where you could kind of do the honors program, or you could do a joint major. But and as a mute, correct me if either I was mistaken or whether that's no longer true, but that felt like that would be too hard to kind of do both at the same time.
I'll speak to that in a second, but there are some differences from when you took it. But I'm going to let you answer this next question first before I get to that. Would you, this is from Asad, would you recommend doing computer science and economics as a dual degree?
Oh, yeah. If you've got the interest and the chops, I think that would be fascinating. Yeah, computer science is basically a pretty good idea, I think, for the way things are going. And if you can combine them, that would be a pretty interesting vantage point on things.
I'm going to speak, before I get to your question, next question here, just speaking to the different aspects of things. So I'm going to make a base assumption. Most of our students here are going to be econ majors, right? So they're not going to have access to the honors program, which is econometrics. However, everyone here should realize that if you have a certain GPA, which is a 3.0, you do have access to those honors classes, but you just have to ask the econ advisor. Now, I'm the econ advisor, but I do a lot of this stuff. So it's Antea who does most of it. You just have to ask. Would you recommend, based on this, so a lot of our students ask me one basic question: how do I skill develop, right? So I have an econ major. I'm okay. I'm a decent student, but I need to skill develop because I want to get into this specific area. One thing I always say is, you always want to do, say, a minor in statistics or get a minor in something else, whether it's even long form writing, sociology, political science, anything like that. But what's your opinion on boot camps? So we have a lot of boot camps in Van because it's tech city that are doing, like, I haven't heard you mention Python. I haven't heard you mention these things before. Are they useful, and would you recommend that?
Yeah, I think Python has kind of grown as, I think, a popular analytics platform, and maybe often seen as like an alternative to R or Stata, but is also something that can be used more generally. So it's pretty powerful in that sense. So I won't, and because I honestly haven't been like kind of living in the world of the heavier type of analytics like you could do in Python or R for a few years, I'm not well positioned to sort of speak as to like which one to focus on. But in terms of boot camps, I think they can be good if it's going to help you accelerate towards a very particular skill set for like a kind of a particular class of jobs that you're looking for. I was pretty fortunate in finding a position in consulting, and it wasn't the typical management consulting. It was economic consulting, but even still, that gave me, it was a company and an industry that is used to taking in sort of fresh graduates and saying, we'll teach you how to do the job. We don't expect you to know how to do this coming in. We're sort of knowingly recruiting fresh graduates. And then we're going to give you a set of pretty general skills, with some specific data analysis skill sets, and then some more general skills that are widely marketable. And so if you can get into something like that, I would really encourage you to do it, because I think one of the things that I've found is, like, for me early in my career, I wanted to maximize for optionality. Right. So do things that'll open the most amount of doors after doing that, and then kind of keep making the choice towards the thing that will open even more doors. There's not a lot of jobs that I think are like that, and so if you feel like a boot camp will help you get your foot into that sort of first job, because it'll give you a really specific set of skills with a certain amount of credibility from that boot camp, that will help you get that first job, then that could be good. But I guess to me, the first choice would obviously be to find find a company that's just willing to hire new grads, and go that way. And then you can learn on the job or do boot camps while, at night while you're doing that job, if you want to like pivot skills. Nothing against boot camps. I think it's important to keep learning and to make that part of something that you're going to own for yourself, is to keep your eyes open, be looking around the industry at what's sort of adjacent to what you're doing now, and say, what skills would I need to develop to be able to go into that next thing that looks really interesting.
I've got a couple more questions here. Okay, but before we do that quickly, sorry guys, I just have to address this. Can you tell me what the importance and how important LinkedIn is with your job search, and generally how LinkedIn is viewed in San Francisco? Or, generally in that. Sorry, go ahead.
Loved and hated. I think the reality is it's still heavily used for recruiting and job hunting. Get your profile together and connect with people, and be willing to reach out and ask for intros to people at companies that have job openings that you want, or just companies, even if they don't have a job opening that you want, companies that look interesting to you. That being said, I think there's also alternatives. People use other social media pretty effectively. I would say more so Twitter than anything else can be a really great way to connect with experts in an industry, and people that work at companies that you like. You can just follow them, see what they're interested in, see what they're talking about, and sort of track an industry that way. And you can amazingly interact with some of the most influential people in the world. Where like I've had sent messages back and forth with like Nobel laureate Richard Thaler on Twitter, which is just kind of like mind blowing. Wow. And not that it was in any way meaningful or but like, it's just like, it really kind of breaks down, and it puts the world like right at your fingertips.
No doubt. Let's just get to this next question. Thanks, Rob. Having worked in different companies before, what most surprised you when you transitioned to Google? That's a good question.
Ooh. So there's two ways to think about this. I would say Google is pretty well publicized. Like there's even a Vince Vaughn and Owen Wilson movie about like working at Google. So it's in a lot of ways like as advertised. It's pretty awesome. It's pretty fun, and like people are really nice and really smart. So it kind of lives up to all of that. I would say the thing that's been surprising and is probably important to pass along. Somebody mentioned this during my interview process there. It was just like, hey, you've got to be really adaptable. This place changes constantly. Like, don't get attached to your manager or your desk or really your job, because things will change rapidly. And that's been extremely true. So if you like a lot of structure, and you want things sort of laid out for you as to like, okay, do this, then this, then this, and that's sort of like the path to success. That's great. It's just that Google in particular is not a good environment for that. You have to be very comfortable with an ambiguous environment, and just kind of figuring things out as you go along, and then be adaptable to change. I went through probably 3 different managers in the first year. The first team I joined got shut down, and desk changes and all that kind of stuff. So adaptability and comfort with ambiguity.
Thank you. I've got another question here, and we're going to be wrapping it up soon. So if I have the GPA right now, would you suggest I go for a joint major? And do you think web development skills have any importance in the economics field? Like like, would it give me a kind of an edge? So the first question is joint major. What do you think? And I'm assuming they're saying BBA.
Oh, so I mean, I would say play to your strengths. So for me, I'm happy that I didn't end up doing a BBA because I think doubling down on economics and going deeper in it paid off for me. I was more passionate about it. So I worked harder, I got better grades, and you know that kind of paid off for me. And I was able to pick off a few interesting business courses that gave me some exposure even without doing a joint major or even officially a minor. But if you're really passionate about some other field that you want to do a joint major with, then go for it. I'm a big supporter of kind of a more of a generalist path. So if you can combine skills, great. I think there's a lot of opportunity at the intersection of fields.
So do you think web development skills have any importance in the economics field?
Yeah, along those lines, I can't think of anything in particular specific as to like how I've seen people combining those, but sure. I mean, understanding both of those things is certainly going to be a leg up in the way that business is conducted these days.
Perfect. Just in a brief summary, Rob and I have connected and we knew each other, obviously, he was an undergrad, but we kept in touch through LinkedIn. I connected with all of our alumni speakers through LinkedIn. It's a very, very powerful tool to stay in touch, and it's helped us as a department tremendously. We have 1,000 LinkedIn members, a vast array of people, and we talked about some of our alumni that are speaking. So that's important to realize. The other thing is get involved. I mean, I cannot say this enough. Just coming to this is important because a lot of this you might like, a lot of it you're like, oh no, this is not for me. It's tremendous because everyone that's been a part of the alumni series have come to every career workshop or whatever it is that they've come to, and their attitude has always been, hey, listen, this is not going to harm me, so I might as well go to things. Finally, start building a network. I mean, your network starts here. Your network starts with Rob if this is your first link. And I encourage you to do so because it's it's vitally important that you do that. Most of your jobs are going to come through networks, so that's important to realize. And I wanted to highlight the fact that you think that Rob is at Google and he's a brilliant guy. There's no doubt about it. But I know he was not at the top of his class. He came in from a transition program from Langara, and he worked his way in and through econ and then to his master's. What happened was he was curious about econ and he got into it. Simple. And he asked questions, but most of all, he listened and he spoke to a lot of people at econ. Him and I had many conversations before he went on to do his master's at Queen's. So I encourage you to talk to as many people at SFU as possible. SFU is a perfect place to to launch that because we're a medium-sized school. We're not so huge that it's impersonal. So I think that was probably a big key. I'm assuming you agree with that, Rob. But finally, I want to thank Rob for joining us. This is terrific.